Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, gathered here in the quiet hush of this evening, let us turn our minds to a story that whispers from the shadows of our history, a tale that begins in the mist-shrouded hills of a forgotten corner of America, where faith was meant to be a beacon, but instead became a snare. Imagine, if you will, the Sterling Seminary, rising like a solemn sentinel against the winter sky, its spires piercing the clouds, promising enlightenment and divine purpose to all who crossed its threshold. Oh, but what promises they were, veiled in sanctity, yet woven with threads of greed that tightened like a noose around the unwary eye in the quiet embrace of a fog-laden valley, nestled deep within the rugged hills of a long-forgotten corner of America, there once stood a place that seemed to embody the very essence of divine aspiration. Picture it with me now, the Sterling Seminary, a grand edifice of weathered stone and towering Gothic arches, rising solemnly against a sky often heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves were leaning in to listen. Its spires, sharp and unyielding, pierced the mist like fingers reaching toward salvation, while the surrounding landscape offered a profound isolation, ancient oaks twisting their branches in silent vigil, narrow dirt roads winding through dense forests that swallowed sound and light alike, and the distant murmur of a hidden stream that seemed to carry whispers from another world. It was here, in this remote sanctuary far removed from the clamor of cities and the prying eyes of the outside world, that the seminary presented itself as a beacon of piety and scholarly devotion. Established in the waning years of the 19th century, during an era when spiritual revival swept across the nation like a cleansing wind, Sterling was founded with the noblest of intentions, or so the story went. Its founders spoke of creating a haven for theological study, a place where young men and women of faith could retreat from worldly distractions to immerse themselves in scripture, philosophy, and the rigorous pursuit of moral clarity. The architecture alone told a tale of reverence, stained glass windows depicting scenes of martyrdom and redemption, casting jewel-toned light across flagstone floors worn smooth by generations of kneeling penitents, vast libraries lined with leather-bound tomes that smelled of aged paper and incense, chapels where the echo of hymns lingered long after the voices had faded. To the travelers who chanced upon it, perhaps a weary preacher seeking respite or a family delivering a son or daughter into what they believed was God's protective embrace, the seminary appeared as nothing short of sacred. Its gates, wrought iron adorned with crosses and vines, opened onto manicured grounds where roses bloomed even in the chill of autumn, tended by silent figures in simple robes who moved with a grace that suggested inner peace. Bells tolled at dawn and dusk, their deep, resonant calls drifting across the valley like a summons to prayer, inviting all who heard them to pause and reflect on higher things. Visitors would speak in hushed tones of the serenity that enveloped the place, how the air itself felt purified, carrying the faint scent of candle wax and polished wood, as though holiness had seeped into the very earth. In those early days, word spread slowly but steadily through church circles and religious publications. Sterling Seminary became synonymous with uncompromising devotion, a training ground for ministers, missionaries, and scholars who would carry the gospel to the farthest reaches. Prospective students arrived with letters of recommendation from respected pastors, their eyes bright with anticipation, trunks packed with Bibles and notebooks, dreaming of the profound transformations awaiting them. The faculty, robed in black with white collars stark against their throats, greeted them with warm handshakes and solemn blessings, their voices rich with authority and compassion. Lectures were delivered in grand halls beneath vaulted ceilings, where the acoustics amplified every word as if the building itself endorsed the teachings. Yet, even in this carefully cultivated aura of tranquility, there were subtle undercurrents that only the most perceptive might notice, a certain wariness in the eyes of the longer resident students, the way conversations hushed when strangers approached, or how the seminary's isolation felt less like a retreat and more like a deliberate seclusion. The surrounding hills, with their perpetual shroud of mist, did not merely obscure the view, they concealed the institution from scrutiny, allowing it to exist in a world apart, governed by its own inscrutable rules. Outsiders rarely lingered long, ushered politely but firmly back to the gates with gifts of handwritten prayer books or small vials of holy water, reminders of the purity they had briefly touched. And so, the facade held firm, year after year, drawing in those who sought something greater than themselves. The Sterling Seminary stood as a monument to faith's enduring promise, its silhouette against the twilight sky evoking a sense of timeless mystery, where the line between the earthly and the divine seemed tantalizingly thin. It was a place that invited trust without question, where the pursuit of enlightenment appeared absolute, and where the shadows cast by its towering walls promised shelter rather than concealment. In this setting of profound beauty and apparent sanctity, one could almost believe that here, at last, the soul might find unadulterated truth, untouched by the corruptions of the broader world. But as the decades unfolded, and as more souls crossed those imposing thresholds with hope in their hearts, the mist began to part just enough to reveal glimpses of something far more sinister stirring beneath the surface of this pious veneer. Yet, beneath this veneer of holiness, where prayers echoed through the corridors like solemn promises and the air hummed with the quiet devotion of those seeking higher callings, a shadow began to lengthen, subtle at first, like the faint creep of dusk, across those ancient hills. It was not a sudden rupture, no thunderclap of revelation that shattered the illusion overnight, but a slow, insidious unraveling, hints that something profound and profane had taken root within the very foundations of Sterling Seminary. Whispers circulated among the newer arrivals, fleeting glances exchanged in the dim light of the dining hall, where the clink of silverware against china masked conversations that trailed off abruptly when a faculty member drew near. These were not the idle gossips of youth, they were the first tremors of unease, born from discrepancies too glaring to ignore forever. Consider the way certain ledgers were guarded with an almost feverish zeal, volumes of financial records locked away in the administrator's private study, accessible only to a select few whose loyalty had been tested over years. Donations poured in generously from devout families across the country, widows sacrificing their mites, congregations pooling resources to support the training of future shepherds of the flock, yet the seminary's grandeur seemed to expand in ways that defied simple explanation. New wings were added to the main building, ornate furnishings imported from Europe adorned the private quarters of the leadership, and lavish retreats for the inner circle were whispered about in tones of envy and suspicion. Where did the money truly go? The official account spoke of expansions for the glory of God, of scholarships for the deserving poor, but rumors persisted of offshore holdings, of investments in ventures far removed from spiritual pursuits, land speculations, perhaps, or silent partnerships in industries that profited from human frailty. Then there were the personal indulgences, glimpsed in fleeting moments, a gleaming automobile parked behind the chapel, far beyond the modest means of a man sworn to poverty and service, fine wines shared in closed-door gatherings while students subsisted on plain fare, jewelry that caught the candlelight during evening vespers, worn by those who preached detachment from worldly goods. These were not overt displays, mind you, no brazen flaunting that would invite immediate outrage, but calculated subtleties, enough to plant seeds of doubt in observant minds. A young seminarian might overhear a late-night conversation through a thinly walled dormitory, fragments of talk about necessary compromises or securing the future, phrases laced with a defensiveness that belied their innocence. Another might notice how certain students, those from influential families or with promising connections, received preferential treatment, better rooms, lighter duties, access to restricted libraries, while others toiled in obscurity, their questions met with stern rebukes about humility and obedience. The deception ran deeper still, woven into the very teachings imparted in those vaulted lecture halls. Doctrines were selectively emphasized, verses twisted to justify the accumulation of wealth as a sign of divine favor, much like the prosperity preachers who would later scandalize the airwaves, but here in quieter, more insidious form. Greed was recast as stewardship, ambition as holy zeal, and any challenge to the hierarchy branded as rebellion against God's appointed order. Recruits were drawn in with visions of prestige and power, promises of influential postings upon ordination, networks that extended into the corridors of political and economic might. Yet, for many, the reality proved a trap, debts incurred for tuition that mysteriously ballooned, obligations that bound them to the institution long after graduation, enforced through veiled threats of ruined reputations or withheld endorsements. Isolation amplified it all, that deliberate remoteness which had once seemed a shield against worldly corruption now serving as a barrier to outside scrutiny. Mail was sometimes delayed or inspected, visitors carefully vetted and escorted, ensuring that tales of discontent rarely escaped the valley. Those who dared voice concerns found themselves isolated further, assigned extra penances, counseled in private sessions that left them questioning their own perceptions, or quietly encouraged to depart for more suitable paths elsewhere. A few letters did slip through, however, smuggled out by the bold or the desperate, anonymous missives to bishops or benefactors hinting at irregularities, pleas for investigation that were often dismissed as the ravings of malcontents or the work of external agitators. In this way, the darkness revealed itself not in cataclysmic bursts but in accumulating layers, each small compromise, each unchecked excess building upon the last until the pious facade began to crack, exposing the avarice that had festered unchecked. What began as a sanctuary of faith had, over time, morphed into a machinery of self-perpetuation, where greed masqueraded as governance and deception as discretion. The true horror lay in its ordinariness, in how easily human frailty could corrupt even the most sacred vows, turning shepherds into wolves cloaked in the fleece of righteousness. And as more eyes opened to these veiled truths, the tension mounted, a gathering storm that threatened to expose the rot at the core and force a reckoning long overdue. Among the countless lives that brushed against the cold stone of Sterling Seminary, it is the faces of the entrapped, the wide-eyed, the trusting, the desperately hopeful, that haunt the story most fiercely. They came from every corner of a restless young nation, farm boys with calloused hands clutching dog-eared Bibles, daughters of shopkeepers who had memorized entire books of Scripture before their 16th birthday, orphans handed over by charitable societies with the assurance that here, at last, they would find family in Christ. They arrived on rattling stagecoaches or, later, on dusty Model Ts, stepping onto the gravel drive with suitcases tied by twine and hearts brimming with the conviction that God had singled them out for something extraordinary. Many were poor, their tuition paid not in coin but in promises, promises of future tithes, of future congregations, promises that the seminary's leaders recorded with courteous smiles and ironclad contracts. Others were the children of privilege, sent by ambitious fathers who saw in Sterling a shortcut to ecclesiastical influence, a place where alliances were forged in oak-paneled studies and whispered over brandy that no student ever tasted. Still others were the broken ones, widows seeking purpose after burying husbands and children, Confederate veterans carrying unseen wounds from battlefields where they had cried out to a seemingly silent heaven, immigrants whose accents marked them as outsiders everywhere else but who were told that here, in this valley, every tongue would be welcomed in prayer. You could see them in the sepia photographs that survived, rows of young men in stiff collars, eyes shining with something between terror and rapture, young women in high-necked dresses, hands folded demurely, yet clutching one another's fingers beneath the folds of their skirts as though sensing the undertow before it pulled. Their names read like an old Sunday school roll call: Elijah Grayson from the Carolina foothills, who could quote Augustine before he could shave; Miriam O'Connell, red-haired and fierce, who had walked barefoot from Tennessee after her father drank the farm into ruin; Samuel Park, the son of Korean missionaries, promised that Sterling would make him the bridge between East and West; Ruth Weinberg, who hid her Jewish heritage beneath layers of borrowed certainty because the seminary offered the only scholarship her brilliance could afford. They rose before dawn for prayers that lasted hours, knees grinding against unforgiving kneelers while the leadership slept in feather beds. They copied lectures by lamplight until their fingers cramped, believing every underlined syllable was a step closer to salvation. They surrendered photographs of sweethearts, letters from mothers, even the small treasures that tethered them to childhood, a harmonica, a lock of baby hair, a pressed violet, because detachment from the world was the price of holiness. When exhaustion or doubt crept in, they were told it was the devil testing their resolve, and they wept in confessionals, begging forgiveness for their weakness while the real architects of their torment listened with practiced compassion. Some broke quickly. A boy from Vermont hanged himself in the bell tower after his pleas for release from an impossible debt were met with sermons on perseverance. A girl from Louisiana vanished one winter night. The official story spoke of homesickness, but decades later her unmarked grave was found beneath the rose garden she had tended with bleeding hands. Others endured for years, graduating into ministries where they were required to funnel offerings back to the seminary that had raised them, becoming unwitting recruiters who lured fresh souls with the same luminous promises that had once ensnared them. They aged prematurely, faces etched with a peculiar hollowness, the look of people who have seen behind the curtain of their own faith and cannot unsee the machinery of control. Yet even in their suffering was harvested. Their letters home, censored and polished, became fundraising gold, glowing testimonies of transformation that brought in ever larger donations. Their forced smiles and promotional brochures reassured anxious parents that their children were safe, cherished, chosen. Their silence, purchased with shame, fear, or the fragile hope that obedience might yet earn them God's favor, became the seminary's most powerful shield. They were not statistics to be tallied, they were living offerings laid upon an altar of ambition, their youth and fervor distilled into wealth and influence for men who preached poverty while counting gold in hidden vaults. And still, in stolen moments of grace flickered among them, midnight gatherings in the laundry room where they shared crusts of bread and whispered truths too dangerous for daylight, coded entries in journals that read like psalms of lament, acts of quiet rebellion, a hidden novel, a forbidden song hummed under breath, a hand slipped comfortingly into another's during compulsory silence. They loved one another fiercely in the only ways left to them, forging bonds that outlasted the institution itself. Some escaped, carrying scars that never healed but also carrying fragments of one another's courage. Others remained, becoming the next generation of enforcers or ghosts wandering the corridors long after death. They were, in the end, the true heart of Sterling Seminary, not the stone, not the spires, not the gilded lies, but these tender, trusting souls who believed goodness dwelt here and paid for that belief with pieces of themselves they could never reclaim. Their innocence was the currency that kept the entire deception afloat, their pain the mortar between every lying brick, their vanished dreams the incense that masked the stench of greed. And somewhere, in attics and archives, in the trembling memories of the few who broke free, their stories wait like embers beneath ash, refusing to die, demanding that we look full into their faces and swear, never again. I and the shadowed annals of Sterling Seminary, where vows of poverty and service were proclaimed from pulpits with fervent conviction. The most chilling revelation is not the supernatural specter one might expect in tales of horror, but the profoundly human frailty that allowed greed to infiltrate and corrupt what was meant to be untouchable ground. Power, when cloaked in the garb of spiritual authority, becomes a potent elixir, intoxicating those who wield it and blinding them to the slow erosion of their own souls. At Sterling, men who entered those gates with genuine calling, perhaps even with fire in their hearts for the gospel, found themselves ascending a hierarchy that rewarded not humility, but accumulation, not shepherding the flock, but shearing it relentlessly. What began as modest ambitions for institutional growth twisted into an insatiable hunger, where every donation, every inheritance bequeathed by the dying faithful, every tithe squeezed from struggling parishioners was funneled not toward the proclaimed mission of saving souls, but toward personal fortification and hidden excess. Consider how insidious this corruption proves. It does not announce itself with brazen theft or overt tyranny, but creeps in through justifications whispered in private chambers. The work of the Lord requires resources, they might say, as new vaults were constructed beneath the chapel floors to safeguard wealth that grew like a malignancy. Influence demands a certain stature, as leaders acquired properties far beyond the valley, estates where they retreated for prayerful reflection amid luxuries that would shame the prophets they claimed to emulate. Greed, in such sacred spaces, wears the mask of necessity, convincing its hosts that their expanding desires serve a higher purpose, the expansion of the seminary's reach, the security of its legacy, while in truth it hollows out the very principles it pretends to protect. Even institutions founded on the rock of faith prove vulnerable when human stewards prioritize self-preservation over surrender, when the fear of scarcity overrides trust in divine provision. This is the timeless warning etched into Sterling's downfall: no sanctuary is immune when avarice is permitted to take root. History echoes with parallel tragedies: the sale of indulgences that ignited reformations, the televangelists whose empires crumbled under the weight of private jets and mansions, the quiet misappropriations in local parishes where trust funds vanish into unexplained, administrative costs. In each case, the corruption thrives because power insulates the corrupt from accountability, because followers, eager for guidance and afraid to question the anointed, become unwitting enablers. At Sterling, oversight was deliberately obscured, boards stacked with loyalists, finances shrouded in esoteric accounting, dissenters marginalized as faithless or divisive. The result was a closed ecosystem where greed flourished unchecked, feeding on the devotion it simultaneously undermined. Yet this horror extends beyond the perpetrators to implicate us all, for it exposes the universal temptation lurking in positions of trust. How easily authority curdles into entitlement, how readily spiritual leadership devolves into lordship over others. The seminary's leaders did not wake one morning as monsters, they succumbed gradually, rationalizing each compromise until the line between stewardship and exploitation vanished entirely. Their deception was not merely financial, it was existential, betraying the sacred trust placed in them by generations of believers who gave sacrificially, believing their offerings built God's kingdom rather than human fiefdoms. In this, Sterling mirrors the broader frailty of fallen humanity, the capacity for even the most exalted calling to be subverted when vigilance wanes and ambition is left unguarded. Societies, too, bear responsibility, for we erect few barriers against such corruption in revered institutions. We grant religious entities tax exemptions and moral deference, assuming piety ensures integrity, only to discover too late that sanctity provides no inherent shield against human vice. Stronger safeguards, transparent audits open to public scrutiny, independent oversight unbound by internal loyalties, mechanisms for whistleblowers to speak without fear of retribution, might have pierced Sterling's veil earlier, sparing countless victims the anguish of shattered illusions. Moral vigilance demands we question not out of cynicism, but out of love for truth, recognizing that unchecked power, even in holy places, invites the darkest impulses to flourish. The tragedy of Sterling compels reflection on our collective duty to fortify against such falls, to cultivate humility in leaders through rigorous accountability, to teach that true spiritual authority flows from service rather than dominion, to remind ourselves perpetually that greed's whisper is loudest in ears accustomed to unquestioned obedience. For if sacred institutions, those very citadels meant to model virtue, can harbor such profound betrayal, then no corner of human endeavor is safe without deliberate, unwavering defenses against the temptations that assail every heart. In confronting this darkness head-on, we honor the innocent ensnared and commit to a fiercer guardianship of trust, ensuring that the light professed in such places is not extinguished by the shadows of avarice within. Yet, even in the suffocating grip of Sterling Seminary's shadows, where innocence was traded like currency and trust lay shattered on the chapel floor, there burned a light that refused to be extinguished, a spark of resilience that flickered in the hearts of those who had been most deeply wounded. It was not a sudden dawn that banished the night, but a gradual glow, kindled by the unyielding spirit of survivors who chose not to let their stories end in silence or despair. These were the ones who, after years of carrying invisible scars, found the courage to step into the light, to speak their truths, and in doing so, to reclaim the power that had been stolen from them. Their journey from victim to victor is a testament to the indomitable human soul, a reminder that even in the deepest valleys of betrayal, hope can take root and flourish, transforming pain into purpose and suffering into strength. Imagine the young woman who arrived at Sterling full of dreams, only to leave with a heart heavy with betrayal, her faith questioned, her sense of self fractured by the manipulations she endured. For years, she wandered in a wilderness of doubt, questioning not just the institution but the very God she had once trusted so completely. Nights were filled with tears, days with a numbness that made the world feel gray and lifeless. But one ordinary morning, as sunlight filtered through her window, she picked up a forgotten Bible, and in its pages, she found not condemnation but compassion, a Savior who wept with her, who understood betrayal from the inside out. That encounter ignited something within her, a quiet determination to heal, to rebuild. She sought counseling, surrounded herself with a community of fellow survivors, and began journaling her story, word by painful word. What emerged was not just personal catharsis but a calling to advocate for others still trapped in similar webs of deception. Her voice, once silenced by shame, grew strong as she shared her testimony at support groups and churches, her words laced with empathy that only comes from having walked through fire. "I thought I was broken beyond repair," she would say, her eyes steady and bright, "but God showed me that broken things can be mended into something even more beautiful." Through her efforts, she helped establish a network for seminary survivors, a safe space where stories were honored, healing was prioritized, and justice was pursued. Lawsuits were filed, not out of vengeance, but from a deep-seated belief that truth must prevail, that no one else should suffer as she had. And when the first perpetrator was held accountable, when the courts echoed with the weight of evidence she and others had gathered, it was a victory that rippled outward, inspiring more to come forward, to say, "Me too." Then there was the man who had given his youth to Sterling, believing it would forge him into a vessel for God's work, only to emerge feeling hollow and used. His path to hope was forged in the fires of forgiveness, not the cheap kind that ignores the wrong, but the hard-won grace that frees the forgiver from bitterness's chains. For a long time, anger consumed him, fueling sleepless nights and strained relationships. But in a moment of raw prayer, he surrendered it all, asking not for the pain to vanish but for the strength to rise above it. That surrender opened doors he never imagined, opportunities to mentor young people entering ministry, to warn them of the pitfalls while encouraging their genuine calling. He wrote a book, raw and unflinching, detailing his experiences without sugarcoating the horror, yet ending each chapter with a thread of hope, a verse, a reflection, a promise that God redeems even the darkest chapters. His story touched thousands, drawing letters from readers who found in his words the permission to grieve, to question, and ultimately to rebuild. One reader, a former student still at the seminary, credited his book with giving her the courage to report an abusive professor, sparking an internal investigation that led to reforms. "Your resilience showed me I wasn't alone," she wrote, "and that there's life after this." Through speaking engagements and podcasts, he became a beacon, reminding audiences that hope isn't the absence of pain but the presence of purpose amid it. His life became a living sermon, that from the ashes of deception, a ministry of authenticity can rise, one that honors truth over tradition and people over power. These survivors' resilience wasn't solitary, it was communal, a chorus of voices rising together. They formed alliances with journalists who uncovered hidden documents, with lawyers who fought pro bono for justice, with churches that opened their doors for healing retreats. Each step forward was a defiance against the seminary's legacy of control, a declaration that their stories would not be buried, that their pain would not be in vain. And as investigations deepened, as media spotlight illuminated the greed, the tide turned. Perpetrators faced consequences, some imprisoned, others stripped of their titles, the institution itself forced into transparency with mandatory audits and victim compensation funds. It was messy, imperfect justice, but it was justice nonetheless, a hard-fought dawn after endless night. In this unfolding of hope, we see the profound truth that horror, no matter how dark, does not have the final word. The survivors of Sterling Seminary teach us that resilience is born in the choice to keep going, to seek help, to forgive, not for the offender's sake, but for one's own liberation. Their lives inspire us to examine our own institutions, to ask hard questions, to demand accountability before tragedy strikes. They show us that pursuing truth and justice isn't just about righting past wrongs, it's about building a future where faith is genuine, where power serves rather than exploits, where every soul is valued as sacred. More than that, they embody the promise that God is a redeemer, weaving even the threads of suffering into a tapestry of beauty and purpose. In their laughter at family gatherings, in their advocacy that protects the vulnerable, in their worship that now rings true and free, we glimpse the victory of light over darkness. Their stories call to each of us, to stand up, to speak out, to hold fast to hope, knowing that in the pursuit of justice, we participate in something divine. They remind us that no scar is too deep for healing, no night too long for morning to break. And in their triumph, we find our own courage stirred, ready to face whatever shadows may come, armed with the unshakable belief that goodness will prevail, that love will win, that hope endures forever.